Imagine a world where nearly every nation, rich or poor, ally or adversary, relies on the same country's money to survive. A world where global trade, energy, debt, and even emergency rescues all flow through a single currency. That world already exists. And the currency at its center is the United States dollar. What makes this remarkable is not that the dollar is widely used, but that it is unavoidable. Countries that openly challenge US power still accumulate dollars. Governments that vow independence from Western influence still settle trade in dollars. During crises, capital does not scatter across the globe, it rushes toward the United States. The dollar becomes stronger precisely when the world feels weakest. This reality feels natural today, almost invisible, but it is anything but inevitable. Currencies rise and fall throughout history. Empires fade, financial systems collapse and reset. Yet, the dollar has outlived gold, outlasted rivals, and survived repeated predictions of its demise. Not because it is flawless, but because the global system has been engineered around it. It traces the hidden mechanics, historical accidents, and structural pressures that transformed a national currency into the backbone of the global economy, and shows why, for most of the world, opting out is no longer a real choice. Today, let's turn to the question, why the world is forced to use the dollar. To understand why the world uses the dollar, one must begin not with America's rise, but with Europe's collapse. Before the 20th century, global finance was centered on the British pound. London was the world's financial capital, and sterling was the dominant reserve currency. That system rested on the British Empire's trade networks, naval dominance, and gold-backed credibility. World War I shattered that order. Britain emerged financially weakened, deeply indebted, and unable to sustain the gold standard without severe domestic strain. World War II finished the job. Europe's industrial base lay in ruins, its currencies shattered by inflation, capital controls, and physical destruction. Global trade required a new anchor, and Europe could no longer provide one. The United States, by contrast, emerged from World War II not only intact, but strengthened. Its factories had expanded, its gold reserves had accumulated, and its financial system had matured. By 1945, the US held the majority of the world's monetary gold. In a global system desperate for stability, the dollar filled a vacuum no one else could. The dollar's dominance was not accidental. It was formalized in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, where allied nations designed a new global monetary order. Under the Bretton Woods system, currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. The dollar became the system's anchor, the reference point against which all others were measured. Two institutions cemented this architecture: the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Both were designed to stabilize currencies, finance reconstruction, and manage balance of payments crises using the dollar as their operational core. This arrangement did more than stabilize exchange rates. It embedded the dollar into the rules, norms, and habits of global finance. Central banks accumulated dollars. Trade contracts were written in dollars. Debt obligations were denominated in dollars. By the time Bretton Woods formally collapsed in the 1970s, the dollar was already indispensable. In 1971, the United States severed the dollar's link to gold, ending the Bretton Woods system. On paper, this should have weakened the dollar. It was no longer convertible into a physical asset, only backed by confidence in the US government and its institutions. Many expected the dollar's dominance to fade. Instead, it deepened. By the early 1970s, the global economy no longer needed gold-backed money. It needed liquidity, scale, and stability. The US financial system provided all three. Its treasury market was large enough to absorb global savings, its institutions were trusted, and its economy was capable of supporting a fully fiat currency without immediate collapse. Freed from the constraints of gold, the dollar became more flexible, not less. It could expand with global trade, respond to crises, and serve as the backbone of an increasingly complex financial system. Other nations lacked markets deep enough to replicate this model. When gold disappeared from the system, the dollar did not lose its role. It inherited a far more powerful one. One of the most powerful mechanisms forcing dollar usage is trade pricing. Most global commodities, oil, natural gas, wheat, copper, and industrial metals, are priced and settled in dollars. This is not a symbolic choice. It is a practical one. When exporters price in dollars, they reduce currency risk. When importers pay in dollars, they avoid complex hedging across multiple exchange rates. Over time, this standardization creates a self-reinforcing loop. Because commodities are priced in dollars, countries must earn or borrow dollars to buy them. Because they must hold dollars, they prefer to trade in dollars. The system feeds itself. Oil plays a particularly central role. The so-called petrodollar system ensures that energy, the lifeblood of modern economies, flows through dollar channels. Even countries that resent US influence cannot realistically opt out without destabilizing their own economies. Central banks do not hold dollars out of loyalty. They hold them because alternatives are worse. A reserve currency must be liquid, widely accepted, and stable in crisis. The dollar meets these criteria better than any competitor. When financial panic strikes, capital does not flee to euros, yuan, or gold at scale. It flees to US Treasury bonds. This behavior is not ideological, it is empirical. In moments of stress, the global system demands an asset that can absorb trillions of dollars without collapsing. Only the US Treasury market is large enough to perform that role. As long as this remains true, central banks are effectively forced to hold dollars, even when doing so exposes them to US policy decisions beyond their control. Another reason the world uses the dollar is that the Federal Reserve functions, in practice, as a global monetary authority. When the Fed raises or lowers interest rates, capital flows shift worldwide. Emerging markets feel tightening instantly. Asset prices reprice across continents. During crises, the Fed extends dollar swap lines to foreign central banks, providing emergency liquidity. No other institution can do this at comparable scale. The Eurozone lacks a unified fiscal authority. China maintains capital controls. Japan's financial markets, while advanced, lack global reach. This makes the dollar system paradoxical. Countries resent dependence on US monetary policy, yet rely on it in emergencies. The system is unequal, but it is also stabilizing. That trade-off keeps it intact. Many developing countries are forced into dollar usage through debt. International loans, bonds, and development financing are overwhelmingly denominated in dollars. This exposes borrowers to currency risk. If their local currency depreciates, their dollar debts become harder to repay. Why accept this risk? Because dollar financing is cheaper and more accessible. Investors trust dollar-denominated contracts. Legal systems, rating agencies, and global banks are structured around them. For countries seeking capital, rejecting the dollar often means rejecting development itself. Over time, this creates a structural dependency. Domestic financial systems remain shallow. Local currencies remain volatile. Dollar usage deepens. The cycle is difficult to break without long-term institutional reform that few countries can afford politically. Perhaps the most underappreciated reason the world is forced to use the dollar is network effects. Money is valuable not because it exists, but because others accept it. Once a currency becomes dominant, switching away from it requires coordinated global action. For an alternative currency to replace the dollar, it would need to be used simultaneously for trade, reserves, debt, and settlement. Partial adoption is insufficient. Fragmentation increases costs and risk. As a result, even countries exploring alternatives often continue using the dollar in parallel. This is why repeated predictions of the dollar's imminent collapse have failed. The issue is not whether alternatives exist, it is whether they can overcome the massive coordination problem the dollar has already solved. The euro is often cited as a potential rival yet it lacks a unified fiscal authority and safe asset equivalent to US treasuries. The Chinese yuan faces capital controls and political opacity that limit trust. Gold lacks yield and flexibility. Digital currencies lack scale and stability. Each alternative addresses one weakness of the dollar while introducing others. None offers a complete system. The dollar persists, not because it is perfect, but because it is sufficiently functional across every dimension that matters simultaneously. Dollar dominance is reinforced by geopolitics. Access to the dollar system, especially clearing and settlement networks, can be restricted. This gives the US extraordinary leverage. Sanctions do not require military force. They require control over financial plumbing. Critics argue this weaponization accelerates de-dollarization. In practice, it often reinforces dollar dependence. Countries seek workarounds, but most global commerce still touches the dollar system somewhere along the chain. Complete isolation is economically devastating. Thus, power and dependence coexist. The dollar is both a shield and a lever. The most important conclusion is this: the world is not forced to use the dollar by decree, but by structure. Every alternative path carries higher costs, greater risk, or political trade-offs most governments cannot accept. The dollar system, despite its flaws, remains the least bad option in a deeply interconnected world. This does not mean it will last forever. Monetary systems change when underlying power structures change. But such transitions are slow, chaotic, and often crisis-driven. Until a new system offers equal liquidity, trust, and scale, the dollar will remain the default. The world uses the dollar because it inherited a system built during war, reinforced by institutions, and maintained by habit. It persists because replacing it would require rebuilding global finance from the ground up. For now, no country or coalition has proven capable of doing that. The dollar's dominance is not eternal, but it is not fragile either. It is a system held together by history, power, and the high cost of change. And until those foundations shift, the world will continue to use a currency it never truly chose but cannot realistically escape.